know if they're going to be any diagrams tonight. Alright, compared to last time, this will be very thin, and it'll be very light, and we won't have all kinds of ponderous stuff. We're going to look at the first myth that we're going to look at this year, and it's probably going to take us about 3 times to go through it. This time and next 2 weeks from now, and then the third we'll finish everything off. Last time we talked about the 3 gray sisters that had 1 eye and 1 tooth between them. We were told how they were compromised by Perseus in his quest for the head of Medusa. He sneaked up a little bit at a time and grabbed the eye away from them. And we use that as a starting point for the whole series of talks, which is going to be on triangles and trinity and threefold qualities or threefold forces as they are in body, in soul, and in spirit. And we're going to look at them both in a larger macrocosm and in our daily lives. It is the intent with looking at the stories to get at the moral, to get at the meaning, and then to take the meaning and be able to live it. Our lives are really the living out historically of myths, and as we find the meanings and can put more meaning into our lives are more fulfilling. In that, we're going to try to be very, very informal, which means I should probably stumble over my feet or something like that, because the way of mysticism is always informal. All religions, and most especially Christianity, were born out of informality, and every attempt to turn them into something formal has turned out to be disastrous to their ends. As soon as we formalize something, we harden it, and when we harden it, we take it away from its life, and it becomes something very, very dead. Pretty much in a word, that's what the whole talk is about tonight, is hardening. We're going to do the myths sort of like the ancients did. And that is, the stories are going to have all sorts of other stories in them and a lot of side stories and such like that. I'm going to try and present them that way, because if you read one of the Greek dramas, that's the way the Greek dramas are. They're nothing but one mythical illusion after another, after another, after another. And when they're put into a form that we can read in the Western world, they're cleansed of almost all the myth at all. Otherwise, we wouldn't understand them. Okay, so then it is through living forms that the transcendental is realized. And these forms, or living through these forms, is how we come to be what we are. And then by looking through and living through some of these forms, we can come to see what our culture and what our consciousness is by reliving or re-understanding what some of those forms are. And that's what we're going to do. As much as we can this year, we're going to look at classic and classical vehicles that have been used to portray myths of triangularity. And the first myth that we're going to look at is the myth of Oedipus. And what we're going to use as a cultural vehicle, oh my goodness, I didn't bring the book along, which means I won't get to read, which means I won't embarrass myself. I'm not a very good reader, and especially when I get a little bit nervous. We're going to look at the Oedipus myth, and we're going to look at 3 plays by Sophocles. For the most part, we're going to stick with Oedipus the king, which is tells the central story of Oedipus. We're going to deal a little bit with Oedipus at Colonus, and almost nothing at all with the third one, Antigone. And we're going to do it all through mythical illusion or allusion. And these plays by Sophocles were all performed at the Dionysia. And Dionysius, which literally means lame god, was the son of Zeus and either Demeter, or Zeus and Io, or Zeus and Dione, or Zeus and Persephone, or Zeus and Lethe. Take your choice. There are different variants. Some of them are partisan. I prefer Zeus and Persephone, his daughter, as the source of Dionysus. The whole theme of lame gods in all cultures, especially in the Indo-European myths, in India and in Greece, the creator gods were lame. And I believe that has something to do with the immobility represents that the spiritual consciousness or the intelligence was not put into the active, busy work, but was put into the inner kind of change. And in that there was a lot of creativity. Plato, who was a deep student of the mysteries and an initiate himself, talks about two different types of motion. Motion or change relative to something outside of yourself, sort of like if you're walking along, your perspective to something outside of yourself changes, and change within yourself, which is sort of like growing older or developing something new within your consciousness, and it is that kind of change that the lame gods represent. It represents a consciousness taken out of movement relative to the external and put into creative activity internally. We've talked a little bit about Dionysus before. He was a horned god, and he was crowned with serpents. And some people would take this part of the myth very literally, in that the mysteries were, and a lot of civilization were developed through Dionysus, and the horned gods were, according to someone like Madame Blavatsky, incarnations of people who had to do penance from Mercury. And they came here to help us with our extremely laggardly ways and to promote their own evolution after they had fallen behind. They took on a really hard work. That certainly is us. And Blavatsky says that when they walked as gods among humans, they even had lumps in their foreheads that were said to be horns. But according to the story form, when Dionysus is born, Hera is jealous because he was fathered on someone other than her, and had the jealousy. She played the jealous wife role a lot, and she had him ripped to shreds immediately at birth, and where his blood flowed, the pomegranate tree came up. And the pomegranate tree represents the mysteries according to the feminine point of view. We won't go into it because the whole idea of many eggs and the possibility of all coming down one shoot is a common theme in Mideastern mythology for the feminine, but we don't have time to go into that. But at any rate, his grandmother, Rhea, said he has to be reconstituted. And we'll remember that because the next big myth we go into goes to that kind of reconstitution act. Zeus, then, being paternally protective, had Persephone take care of Dionysus and guard him. And she took him to the court of King Athnas and persuaded the women to raise the boy so that he would be secluded away in women's quarters. And that way he wouldn't be found by Hera, who would try to do him in again. He reached adulthood, and when he did so, Hera recognized him despite his effeminacy, and she struck him mad. Dionysus, if we know many of the stories of them, conquered either by wine or by violence. He was accompanied by the satyrs and the Maenads. And the satyrs were half goat, half human, and they loved the revelment with the wine. And the Maenads were the ones that went into the Bacchic fury, and anyone that resisted them was ripped into pieces. And there is something, there's a general trend in this myth that we spoke of several years ago when we talked about myths of heroes and initiates, that there are several different types of heroes, and that each hero belongs to one of the 7 rays. And that, like for example, Odysseus belongs to the Mercurial ray, or Orpheus belongs to the Venusian ray and accomplishes his initiation through art. Well, those that belong to the martial ray, like Heracles, or later on, oh boy, am I blanking myself out, Lancelot, all in the process of reaching toward initiation because they have lived on energy, and when they try to transmute that energy, it is too overwhelming for them, and in the process there is madness. And the key for those of the martial ray is to maintain a balance as they develop so that the intellect and the higher spiritual faculties are developed while the energy is still young and in its youth and full-blown activity, so that when it does come time to transmute it, they don't have to try to transmute it all at once and produce madness. But again, Dionysus is another example of the god or hero that goes through the period of madness. But because he is so highly cultured, and because he has all of the divine ways, he has the quality of being androgynous, which is the way we all become as we reach toward the spirit. In the latter half of life, when our etheric vehicle, our vital body becomes stronger, men become little old women, and women become very strong men, because the inner polarity becomes the dominant polarity. And the second half of life is very much like the second half of human evolution that is before us, when we will become male-female, or we will balance the creative energies in ourselves, and from those balanced creative energies of will and imagination become creators instead of creatures, and reach our divine destiny. And so that's indicated by the Dionysus. Before he goes mad, Dionysus invents wine. And he is also then known as Bacchus, the wine god. And it was very necessary that wine be developed, because almost all of the sins of humanity have to do with selfishly hanging on to the past or remnants of the past. And in pre-Dionysian times, people still had the internal clairvoyance, and they knew that this was their connection with the divine. It was an involuntary clairvoyance, and it wasn't completely at their control, And it wasn't a consequence of something that they had developed by their own efforts or by their own individuation. And this was an impediment to progress. And so wine was brought into the mysteries and into culture because by drinking wine, it closes off the involuntary clairvoyance. This is why the first miracle of Christ after taking the body of Jesus is to change water into wine at the marriage at Cana. This is something that's well known. Rudolf Steiner, for example, was born to a family where he had some hereditary clairvoyance, and in order to overcome that so that it would not get in the way of his developing completely controlled clairvoyance, he took a short period of time in which he drank wine to excess until he was sure that he had completely wiped out all of that kind of clairvoyance and then quit and never drank it again. So this is the way the world was. It needed to have the involuntary clairvoyance, which was a distraction to getting on with the evolution. That had to be shut off. And so wine was instituted, and Bacchus represents the wine god that did this. He traveled the whole world over, at least the known world, to the Egyptians. He went as far south, to the Greeks, because he went as far south as Egypt and the Barbary coast, and he went eventually east to India. And after reaching his eastmost course, he started coming back and completely changing the consciousness of people either by culture or by force. Sort of like if the love doesn't get you, the law certainly will. It has to do then with the transmutation either by creativity or by violence if it isn't. We won't go too much into the mystery of Dionysus or Bacchus or the whole myth of him. I'm just giving you a little bit to give you the idea. See, like when the Greek plays were going on, there would be interludes and side trips into all these myths, and people would almost speak a pictorial consciousness. But at any rate, on the way back, he finds Ariadne, who had been abandoned by Theseus, and she was on an island all alone, and he marries her, and she becomes Liber Bacchus, and he places her up in the stars as the constellation Libra. And her crown he puts straight north of Libra as the northern crown, which is sometimes also known as the wine glass, or in Buddhism it's the beggar's bowl. Eventually, when he had accomplished his task of civilizing and culturing people, he ascends into heaven and sits right down next to his father Zeus. And he left behind him then one of the major mystery schools. It was one of the first post-wine mystery schools. And the mystery schools, as we know, are for people who are of a fiery disposition as opposed to those of a watery disposition. People who have to know and people who have to create and do and make things. Whereas those of the watery disposition are people of faith and people of feeling and of belief and of authority. The fiery children are called Freemasons, and the watery children are called Catholics. And they each have a different temperament for different accomplishing different things through many, many lives. And so the mystery schools were instituted to bring redemption to those who are creative souls, who are intellectual souls, and need redeeming. And this mystery school, in the mystery school, wine played a large part, because wine worked in different ways. For the people at large, we know from the story of Noah in the Bible, the first thing that happened after the flood was Noah was found drunk. And we know that Noah, as descendant of Adam and Eve, was cast out of the Garden of Eden. And that they were cast out of the Garden of Eden and were told that they would have to gain knowledge, not life, but knowledge, and to do so by the sweat of their brow. The Garden of Eden, esoterically, represents the cranium and the consciousness of the spiritual worlds through clairvoyance, which we lost by directing much of the creative energy downward and outward in pleasure seeking. And the etheric streams from the 4 or 5 ethers, depending on whether you polarize one or not, were the rivers that flowed into the Garden of Eden, and they were the etheric streams, and they represented then the driving force of our clairvoyance. This was shut off by drinking. And the myth about drinking, that alcohol makes for hard-working people, is exactly true. So in the Dionysian school, they were the hard-working people, and in the initiate part of it, they were the builders. In fact, they were called the Dionysian artificers. And the Dionysian artificers were artists and craftspeople of very high order. Architects, sculptors, painters, ceramicists, musicians, poets, and playwrights. And this carried down, the Dionysian tradition carried right down to the times of Athens. And in Plato's Athens, there were 2 festivals that were called the Lesser and Greater Dionysia. The Lesser Dionysia lasted for about 4 days, and they were celebrated right around the winter solstice. The Greater Dionysia were celebrated at the time that we call Easter, in late March or early April. So the tradition that we have of the 2 major festivals of a given religious practice being at solstice and Easter time did not begin with Christianity. You can follow them very, very far back into history. And they had the same kind of thing, the quality of right at the solstice and after the full moon of the equinox. The Lesser Dionysia had the phallic processions, in that they came marching in, that the drum major came marching in carrying a great phallus, and then the procession followed behind them. It was a somewhat masculine outlook about things. And then there were songs and dances and things like that, and they had plays, but the plays were put on sort of like by street people or itinerant players. The Greater Dionysia lasted about 6 days, and they coincided with the return of Persephone from the underworld, or you might say the resurrection of Persephone, and they were considered the festivals of joy at being delivered from starvation of winter. In the Greater Dionysia, there was a procession from Lenaeum where they kept an image or an idol of Dionysus, which they took right to a temple right near the Acropolis in downtown Athens, and then they went back out to Lenaeum again and replaced the image, sort of like showing the whole pilgrim cycle of life into the world and then back out to the rustic areas again. And during the whole of the grand procession from Lenaeum, little boys with masks, either tacked on themselves or on sticks, ran along the whole procession, and they chanted poetry. What a beautiful thing. But this went on, the whole festival went on for about 6 days, and the highlight of the whole business was at the end, and it was the grand dramatic competition. And in the grand dramatic competition, there were tragedies, and there were comedies, and there were satires. The Greeks they came into their ripeness right in the epoch of Aries, or in the Aryan age, and consequently, with their coming to ripeness at that time, they were highly competitive people. On almost any occasion, they had athletic games, but they also had competitions by weavers, and the women had domestic competitions, like who could grow the best hair and such like that. And the woman who had the most lovely hair had it cut off, and it made the strings for the lutes for the people who won the musical competitions. But the chief of these competitions was the dramatic competition. And there is a reason for that, because the Greeks represent a watershed in post-Atlantean civilization. You might say that in the past, or the East, it started with India, Babylon, or Chaldea, Persia, somewhere in there was Egypt, and then right in the center you have the Greeks. And then things proceeded to the west and modern times. And the ways before the Greeks were primarily internal, that the consciousness was turned in, and there was a very dreamy, mystical, general consciousness of humanity. Everything after the Greeks, as we know, which is now reaching its height in our society, is exceedingly external. All of our language and all of the changes in the language have to do with names of things. Our whole language is based around external objects. The language of the pre-Greek languages were languages that went back to the names of gods and lived in the consciousness of gods rather than in the consciousness of matter. So you might say that, in a way, these were introvertive, or they were, how would you say it, more deductive, but that gives it too much thought. And in the post-Greek times, we're extrovertive. Yeah. And we are inductive. And the Greeks represent that lovely balance. You might say that between, almost right in the heart of Athens, the times between Plato is on this side, and Aristotle is on the other side. And so the Greeks represent right in the very center of things. Now, each of the arts, according to the mystery schools, are related with a different of the realms that we live in. For example, for the physical world, it is architecture. In that it deals with permanent buildings, and especially stone edifices is like the physical world. For the etheric realm, the art is sculpture. Because in sculpture we show how energy or life works into form. For the desire world, the world of feelings and emotions, it's painting. Because color is the direct manifestation of feeling or emotion or desire. For the realm of concrete thought, it is music. That is distinct notes as an expression of thoughts. In the abstract consciousness, where the transcendent is separated from the physical, the region of abstract thought, the art for that is poetry or drama. Higher up, dance is for the life spirit, and I don't know what goes beyond that. Poetry and drama, because poetry makes all of these connections, which is what it's like in the human spirit. It has that Neptunian-like quality. And drama, because that is where our true selfhood is found, is in the region of abstract or ideational consciousness. Our conception of ourself, we are conceived by the divine. Our conception of selfhood, which we are awakening to, is an idea. It is an idea that becomes an immortal idea. And the nature of that selfhood is character. And so in the process of writing dramas, we produce or we understand the nature of spiritual character. And so then, between drama and music, the two parts of the Greek plays were dramas that were accompanied by music. In fact, it was usually Spartans or Dorians that played the music, and it was Ionians or Athenians that wrote the dramas. And they again represent like a Greek watershed between the transcendent and the phenomenal consciousness. And so it was really important. What I'm trying to say is that different phases of history are important in what they represent in our grand journey of consciousness called evolution, manifest through history. And if we can understand them as parts of a process that step by step, you don't bake the cake first. You mix the ingredients together, and before that you gather the ingredients. And if we can understand history and our lives as part of a process, we can do much better with them, because we aren't then trying to do things at the right things at the wrong time. There were three great tragedians that presented at the Dionysia. They stood above all of the others, and they were Aeschylus. Later on we're going to look at a play by Aeschylus, who is a very, very faithful and pious man, and he was very much dedicated to the orthodox polytheism of Greece, almost to the extent that he was superstitiously a believer. Despite his superstitious blindness, he was still quite intuitive, and he had a lot of knowledge, like book knowledge about the gods, but he was unself-consciously intuitive. He was also a student of astrology, and even his death is anecdotal among astrologers. It's a most interesting story. He studied astrology to find his time of death, and he found out that he was going to die by an object falling on his head and killing him. And he thought, and he knew the day that it was supposed to happen. And so he took himself out into the desert. He says, there's no way that I can die from an object falling on me in the desert. But he had a bright, shiny, bald head, and a sea eagle had a turtle that it had picked up, and it thought it was going to dash it on a rock. And that was the fabled end of Aeschylus. I don't know that it is a completely true story, but it's such a lovely story that you can't help but love it. Euripides, on the other hand, was an iconoclast, and he was an almost atheistical, if not atheistical, skeptical humanist. He was cruel and sardonically honest about the state of humanity. He had an excellent understanding of psychology, but it was tinged with a materialistic kind of fatalism. I don't know if we're going to look at a myth through a Euripides play. I don't know if I have the courage or the desire to want to do that. Sophocles, again, was a watershed person. He stood right in the middle, both in time and in character, and he had a balance between extreme idealism and a practical realism. And his plays, as we're going to see with the Oedipus plays, are a tense balance between freedom and fate. And he looks a lot into the workings of destiny and how we can be free in little ways within destiny. And by the exertion of those little freedoms is how the greater fate could be sidestepped. He was a very gentle man and he was a very kind man, but he still had a pretty good wit. So he made statements about the other two tragedians, and he said of Aeschylus, he's right without even knowing it, which hits it just perfectly. And of Euripides, he says he portrays men as they are, but not as they should be, realizing the need for idealism. There's an awful lot to these statements, more than just witty observation, because Sophocles was an initiate into the Eleusinian mysteries. And he could say that Aeschylus was right because he had the insight from his initiations to know that this was so. Everything that Sophocles, he also knew the value of idealism. Everyone that ever went through the Eleusinian mysteries, especially those that actually went into the deeper mysteries, was very highly regarded, and most had transforming experience, and all of them led stunning moral lives that were themselves examples to the people. He has all of these balances then of fate and freedom and of idealism and realism, and they're all based on concentration. Sophocles was known for his concentration, and his plays are that same way. They're very clean. When you read the other tragedians, he writes almost in a modern style, that they are that clean, that you really get a feeling of it. How deep he went into the Eleusinian mysteries is not known, because you would have to be an initiate to really know that. It was enough so they could speak with authority, and when we come to Oedipus or Colonus, we'll see that there are a lot of direct statements from the mysteries that are right within the dialogue, or right actually within the choruses. He could speak with knowledge and authority. And we mentioned last time that the occult scuttlebutt is that 2 lives later he was reborn as Richard Wagner. And probably in the life in between, he learned music, so it didn't have to depend on those damn Dorians who were sort of like beast-like creatures. He participated in all of the civic duties required of an Athenian, including even being a general in the army. And he was loved for his spirituality, and he was extremely prolific. Extremely prolific. There's another parallel to Wagner. He liked the ladies when he was young, but he was very, very glad when age and maturity kept him away from expression in that way. In fact, he became almost a preacher to that effect. And Wagner was the same way. He had all of these coteries of lovely ladies around him, but by the time he was doing the Parsifal work, he was completely celibate and vegetarian and everything. But Sophocles was extremely prolific. He wrote poems and elegies and paeans, which are kind of a hymn to the gods. He wrote copious amounts of them, but none of them exist anymore. They're all lost. He wrote over 100 plays, of which we have only 7. So the 7 must be important for some historical reason that the Lords of Destiny allowed them to remain. He participated in his dramas, but not as an actor. Aeschylus participated as an actor because he had a strong enough voice, but Sophocles didn't, but he did play the lyre sometimes. He improved stage settings, and he was the first dramatist to have 3. See, I said it's going to be a light night tonight. We'll get some toward the end. He was the first player to have 3 individual actors on stage at the same time. For a long time, it was only one actor and the chorus. And Sophocles was the first, probably in all of history, to write plays with the actors in mind. Practice that Shakespeare took up later on. He lived to be quite old and kept all of his wits about him. Most of the Greeks lived up into the great Greeks that we know from history lived up at least into their 70s, and they were all very active mentally. This is especially true of people who are initiates, because we know, like from Goethe, he was still writing Faust, yet I believe that he was 83 years old. And his death is most interesting. He died while giving a reading from one of his plays. And he was reading out the lines and read out the breath from his body while doing a poetic reading. That's really a way to go. Maybe I'll be able to do something like that. I talk enough that there's a pretty good possibility. He was then the epitome of a middleman, of the middle people, of the middle time, and so he is very much a fulcral man, and again, very strong on faith in freedom. His writing shows concentration and cleanness, despite the fact that there were all of those allusions to myths and more allusions and such like that. And his plays build up an anticipation or a drama for an event that you know is going to happen in the future, but they do it by always looking back to the facts that have come before. And Oedipus is no exception in that. Even though there are 3 Oedipus plays, they were not written as a brace of 3 to be performed at the Greater Dionysia. Oedipus the king was from the middle of his life, and Oedipus at Colonus was from late in life, and Antigone was a very early play, and it tells when you read them. Oedipus the king is the most famous of all, and it's the one that we're going to use most to get at the Oedipus myth. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to start with the play. So if you have a copy of your own, we're going to start with the play. We're going to get through the first page tonight, no more. And we're going to do. There are a lot of flashbacks to things that are not within the play. So the whole method is going to be like it's going to, as I said, we've been telling side myths, and we're going to go into a few more side myths the way they did in the Greek dramas, and we're going to do a lot of flashbacks or retrospections, if you want to call them. The whole play is performed with one setting. It is the palace at Thebes. In fact, it's right in the courtyard in front of the palace. Thebes is in Boeotia, which on the Greek peninsula is right in the center of it. It's right in between Athens and Delphi in the north. Delphi is in the north and Athens is in the south, and so if you could take right in the middle of the peninsula, halfway between those two cities is where Thebes is. It wasn't known as Thebes at the time of Oedipus. It was known as Cadmea. It was named Cadmea after Cadmus, and Cadmus was the founder of it, and Cadmus was one of the children of Agenor. And Agenor and Belus were two kings of Egypt. They were twins. And Agenor, sort of like Cain. I guess we're recording. Every time there is to be a new development historically, there always are those journeys to the east and a recoupment, whether it is the people coming out of Atlantis and going to the Gobi Desert, or whether it is John taking the new Christian mysteries of Christ and going east to Damascus. Always before a new step can be taken, there has to be a recoupment. It's sort of like a retrograde of planets in astrology, that before you can take some new steps forward, you have to go back and digest and get some old things out of the way, and then you can move forward again. That's what's represented by Agenor. He had 6 children, and I got all the names of them written down here. They are Cadmus as the oldest, which means from the east, Phoenix, Cilix, Thusis, Phineas, and the one that we know the most of, Europa, which is where our word Europe comes from. And Europa was an extremely beautiful young woman who used to go walking along the shore of what is now Palestine every day with her friends, and Zeus saw her and fell in love with her. And what he did is he changed himself into a beautiful, beautiful bull, and he mixed with the cows of Agenor. And while he was among them, Europa and her friends went for their morning walk, and they saw him, and she was attracted to this beautiful bull, and she found it to be very, very gentle. And pretty soon she was making garlands and hanging them in the horns and putting them in the mouth, and the bull would hold them in his mouth and wouldn't even eat them. And pretty soon she was inclined to crawl up on the bull's back. Wrong move, because as soon as she gets on his back, he takes off and he dives into the Mediterranean, and he goes swimming across the Mediterranean and lands in Crete. And in Crete, he changes himself into an eagle, and as an eagle, he ravishes her. And she has 3 children, Minos, Rhambamanthes, and Sarpedon, which we could go into sometime. I've wanted to for a number. These are the 3 judges of the underworld in Greek mythology. But at any rate, she's disappeared. And what happens is that the children of Agenor decide to go, the 5 boys decide to go and find their sister. And they each go to a different place to find her. They each go a different direction, and wherever they go, they start the cities. Phoenix went to Carthage, But he eventually came back to Asia Minor a little bit further north and formed what was then known as Phoenicia. Silex formed the land of the Silesians and so on. But Cadmus went first to Rhodes, and he was a very pious man, and he built a temple to Poseidon there. Poseidon was sort of like the spiritual grandfather. The twins were the children of Libya, which is where the modern nation Libya comes from, and Poseidon. Libya was human, Poseidon was divine. So they made a temple to the divine grandfather, and they put a great big urn to Athena in it. And they decided, no, we're not finding her. We have to go on to somewhere else. And then they went to Thrace. And when they got to Thrace, he being the oldest was taking care of his mother. His mother died. And he was feeling desolate and not knowing what to do. So he took all of his people and he walked cross country to Delphi, to the oracle, saying, where can we find my sister? And the oracle said, quit looking for your sister, but follow a cow instead. And so what they did is, as soon as they left the compound at the oracle, they ran into a herdsman who had a cow, and on the back haunches on either side there were the markings of a full moon. And they bought the cow from the herdsman, and they just kept driving it and never let it rest. And they drove it and drove it and drove it until it just sank down and couldn't go anymore. And that's where they founded Cadmea. And the first thing they did was they had to sacrifice. And so they were going to sacrifice to Poseidon. And there was an artesian spring that was sacred to Ares, who was the Greek Mars. And what they did is they went there for lustral water, not knowing that the lustral water was protected by a gigantic serpent or dragon or something like that. And almost all of his men were devoured by the dragon until he took the stone and crushed its head and did his sacrifice. And in his sacrifice, Athena literally appeared to him and said, take the teeth out of the dragon or out of the serpent and sow them into the ground. And so he did. He plowed the ground and put the dragon's teeth down. And immediately men sprang up, but they were fully armed, and they were clashing their weapons like that. And then intuitively he understood he was supposed to do something, so he picked up a stone and he threw it right in the middle of them, and they started fighting with each other. And they fought and fought until there were 5. And when the 5 were done, they just called a truce between them, and they pledged their allegiance to Cadmus sort of as their father, and they became the founders of Cadmea. Much, much later on, Zethus, who was another son of Zeus, came and settled the lower part of Cadmea and named it after his wife, who was called Phoebe, and that's why it is called Thebes to this day. So it doesn't come from Thebes as the Thebes in Egypt. So the play begins with a prologue. And Oedipus, the king, comes out from the palace, and he asks his fellow Cadmeans, why all of these boughs and garlands? Why this incense? Why all this prayer and lamentation? Why the supplications? And the crowd is actually the choruses in the Greek plays. In fact, I should bring some pictures in. The stages still exist to this day. The great Dionysic Theater at Athens still exists. You can go there. And it's still acoustically wonderful that you can almost whisper on the stage and hear it many rows up. It was so designed. But the stage was basically circular, but most of the people sat in a semicircle amphitheater-like. And in front of the stage were two choruses, one called the strophe and one called the antistrophe, and they just went back and forth and they sang. In fact, opera comes from an attempt to reconstruct the ancient Greek dramas. In the times of the Medici in Florence, there was a group of intellectuals that got together and they had these grand speculations and erudite conversations about things of classical Greece, and they tried to reconstruct the Greek dramas, and what came out was what we now call opera. Oedipus is alone on stage, and he calls out to the oldest of the gathered crowd, and he is a priest, and the priest proceeds to tell him that there's a general plague. The plague is affecting the plants with a rust, and it's affecting the animals so that the animals are stillborn, and even people are dying. The herds are all sick, and there's general despair. And Oedipus says to him, well, what about this? And the priest says, well, we know you're just a human, but you are the best of men in adversity. You saved us once before with your wisdom in the ways of God. Save us again. So now we enter the first flashback, and that has to do with Oedipus. Oedipus was not made king as part of his birthright. He was made king by proclamation. He won it by merit, that the people of Cadmea made him the king because he earned it, or because he deserved it. The previous king was Laius, and Laius was a Cadmean by descent, but he was murdered by highwaymen while he was on his way to the oracle at Delphi. And the reason he was going to Delphi was to seek, it was a very dangerous trip, even without being killed by highwaymen. It was a dangerous trip because of the Sphinx. He was going to Delphi to find out what to do about the riddle of the Sphinx. The Sphinx was a monstrous beast. Some say it was the child of Typhon and Echidna, which we spoke of a little bit of last time when we talked about the children of the briny sea. And others say that it was born of the dog Orthus and the famous Chimera. I prefer the Echidna version, but we'll come to that in a little bit. But this great beast had flown in from Ethiopia. And Hera had sent the beast from Ethiopia to punish King Laius. And the reason for punishing King Laius was because he had abducted a boy from the city of Pisa, which I don't think is the Pisa that we know in Italy. But at any rate, what happened was the phoenix it nested right on the top of Mount Phoenicum, right outside the city of Thebes. Then as Thebians or their guests came and went, whenever it felt like it, they stayed in the city because this is the time of city-states, and they had to be that way. The people had to cluster together. For safety, they'd all go in the city in the daytime and at night, and then in the daytime they'd go out and work the fields, and then they'd come back to the city. And it was both an economic and a martial necessity to live in a city-state. And when people would come out, the phoenix would cry out to them its riddle. And the riddle was, what being with only one voice sometimes has 2 feet, sometimes has 3, and sometimes has 4, and is weakest when it has the most? And what happened when the questionee couldn't answer the question, the Sphinx just immediately beset upon it and throttled it and ate it on the spot. And since no one could answer the riddle, they were losing a lot of people, and people were afraid to go out and work the land, which meant there was starvation. Many of the Cadmeans had died, including the queen's nephew. The queen was called Jocasta. There's a lovely pun in the myth. Her nephew's called Haman, and it's a variation on another word called Haman, which means slaughtered. So there's that kind of a thing going on. When Oedipus first arrives in Thebes, he's a wandering man. He's a runaway from home. And as he arrives at Thebes, he's one of the ones that the Sphinx chooses. He's one of the chosen special ones, and it asks him the question, what being with only one voice walks sometimes on 2 feet, sometimes on 3 feet, and sometimes on 4, and is weakest when it has the most? And he says, you could recognize the Sphinx right away because it was a stone bird, and it had the face of a woman, and it had the tail of it had the body of a lion, and the tail of an ox, and the wings of an eagle. And it's just exactly like the Sphinx that is in Egypt. And so it cries out the question to him, and without even thinking, Oedipus says, man who crawls on all 4s when he's a baby, stands firmly on 2 feet when he's an adult, and when he's old he leans on a staff. And he gets it right. And what happens is that the Sphinx is so put off that it just throws itself off the mountain and shatters itself into pieces. And that's what our story is about tonight. We're not going to go much further than that, because now we're going to try and get to some of the meanings of all of that, because there's enough in that little fragment alone for quite a few things. For a whole series maybe, but we'll have only a few minutes, so we'll just zip through. We'll mention right now that we're treating the myth as a myth of initiation. Initiation being when we can leave the human estate, and that is leave our bodies and enter the kingdom of gods. And from that vantage point, see ourselves as others see us, and to be totally objective about our being. Now, we are all aspirants to becoming kings. But we are, even though we are all of divine descent, we saw that last week in the great big family tree that would cover at least 6 or 7 boards full. We could go right back to the one central divinity, and we could trace ourselves back to that kind of parentage. Even though we're of divine descent, we are not crowned just because of our descent. It is only by merit, and it is only by work. The crowned king is the same thing as Eden regained. Anyone who has done much work with prayer and meditation and unfolding inward consciousness realizes that as you start to make a connection by directing the rising spinal energy, if you by produce an impinging connection between the pituitary and pineal, the effect of it is, it's like when you wear a cap that's too tight. You know what I'm saying? When you wear a cap, that you get sort of a numb feeling right around your head, and eventually you have periods where there is so much light from within that seems like almost like before you faint, like everything seems to get dark outwardly. And this crown is the same as the crown of thorns, because with it you recognize how much people really are suffering. But this crown can only be developed by work. And the work that it takes to unfold the clairvoyance just in the very exacting work of the exercises is enormous. So in that regard, we're just like that. We are also like the Cadmeans. We are, as a consequence of our imperfect past, our hard thoughts are descending on us, and they devour us, and eventually bring us to death. We are dying as a consequence of our own pernicious causes. What we are is a result of what we have done in the past. The particular sin of Laius was pedophilia. And I'd like to look into pedophilia a little bit. Being a perverted scorpion type of being, I like to look into all of these things. It's important in recognizing the sin of Laius that Laius killed his own son. He exposed his son on the side of a mountain right after birth. He pierced its legs through and he exposed it on a mountain and left it to die in nature, saying that if destiny and nature intended for the son to live, it would live. We'll go more into that in the future about the story. But Laius killed his own son. Now that is a very important fact leading to his later pedophilia. What a little bit that I have to say on this developed out of a conversation with a man who is a Jesuit priest and who is himself an acknowledged pedophile, though not an active one. It's something that he fights with every day of his life. And he tells me that in some circles of Jesuits, that the word Jesuit is synonymous with pedophile. And that is an extremely important thing relative to past lives. Because the Jesuits were one of those orders that took a vow that once a Jesuit, always a Jesuit. Meaning to say that they would return to the order again and again. Destiny usually breaks up such vows after a long time, but more than 2 or 3 lives it takes. There was a second vow that the Jesuits took, and that was that they would do anything to serve the order. They were very much hated by the Freemasonic side of things. Shakespeare, especially in King John, has very, very ugly things to say about Jesuits and the doctrine of equivocation, which was basically they would swear an oath with the king in the name of the Pope, and then they would go to the other side in a war, and they'd say, well, England is willing to give us this. What are you, France, willing to give to the church? And then they would say, and if France was willing to give more, they would say, we had a revelation between England and France, and they would equivocate and change the whole doctrine. The vow was such, and it is printed in paper, you can find it, that they would do anything. They would lie, they would steal, they would cheat, and even murder for the sake of the order. And that's what's involved with pedophilia. It is a denial of the childlike innocence. You cannot enter the kingdom of heaven except you come as a little child. Laius, by exposing his child to death, destroyed what represented a new spring. It represented innocence. And what pedophilia represents is a love of children that is materialistically misunderstood. It is a desire to recapture innocence, an innocence that you have sworn an oath against, so that you can see that the psychology of something like this is, that there is a character setting that goes with it. And it's easy then to see why it gets passed on from generation to generation. Pedophiles are very often children of other pedophiles. The reason being they had their innocence stolen at a very early age, and they're seeking to relive or refine their own childhood, and so they perpetrate it from generation to generation. So then it is a desire in a physical sense to regain a lost childhood. To a mild extent, all of us having lost our divine innocence in rebellion, all of us are ourselves mildly in that state. I'm not saying that we are pedophiles or anything like that, but we seek something to renew us. We all love seeing little fuzzy little bunnies and puppies and children and something like that, because it represents all of that glorious promise that somehow the mistakes we've made along the way have frozen us away from. And that is the something that is before us. And our own materialistic thoughts, our own selfish thoughts, our sphinx-like sophistication is devouring each of us. The sphinx itself is one of the children of the sea. And we mentioned that last time that Gaia or Gia married her own son Pontus, and from them came a whole line of beings that were all the way from the wise sisters who were deeply wise, the gray, to the beautiful Hesperides, to the very ugly sisters, the Medusa and her sisters, and then all of the monsters, including Echidna, who is a spider-like being. And the salt of the sea from which they are born is an important matter. The salt represents, in our biological experience, that which formalizes or formulates, that which allows us to condense forms. The uterus, the chemistry of the uterus in pregnancy, the whole embryo has a sodium quality. And after 6 months, the chemistry of the body becomes potassium in its orientation, except if you get something like when you start building forms again, like when you start building cancer. The cancer is all shrouded in salt. It's a liquid. It's almost like a little. It's almost like a little fetus all over again. And so the salt has to do with formation of things, consolidation. On the other hand, we know from the words of Christ that the salt has to do, ye are the salt of the earth, but if the salt shall lose its savor, wherewith shall it be salted? Meaning to say that the whole flavor of our character is a consequence of our existence in forms. And that the salt representing the difference between, the salts are all the result of the two extremes of acids and alkalis. And when acids and alkalis meet together, they produce the whole world of salts, the center of which is sodium chloride, which is even shaped like the cube of matter that the Platonists thought represented the material world all the most. And so then the salt water represents a state in which forms are precipitated, out of which forms we get the experience that develops character. All the monsters of the sea then represent projections of creative thoughts that have been projected selfishly and have become malformed. The sea in this sense represents space, or represents the absolute of space as the sea in which the planets float, or within us where our images of our conscious and subconscious nature are developed. Now what's interesting, if we remember what the Sphinx looks like, in the first place it's stony, meaning that it is really hardened. But it is made up of the face, the androgynous or feminine face of a human, the wings of an eagle, and all of the emblems of the fixed signs of the zodiac. Now what is phenomenal about this is, I'm going to pull one on you now, go back to something we talked about several years ago, when we talked about the creation story, the deepest and the most logical creation story of all, what we in Christianity would call the Father principle. The deepest part of the Spirit was called Phanes Protogonos. And out of the egg, the silver egg of night, was born the divine dragon. And that divine dragon had 4 faces to it, and those 4 faces are the same identical faces as the faces of the Sphinx. They also happen to be the faces, I have 2 pages marked here. You can look at them. I'll just pass the book around. This is the cherub. Oh, this is the Ancient of Days. Also surrounded by the same figures, which is the divine spirit with the lion and the bull and the eagle and the androgyne. But the cherub of Ezekiel with 4 faces. So what we're looking at, just have a good time with the book. It'll be probably less boring than the talk. So what we're looking at then is that the most divine attribute of our being, we are profaning in our materialism, so that Phanes is called Phanes Protogonos. That is the creator of all things. From the divine spirit, everything else is created. It is the egg of night, and remember we said the egg just represented a form in the darkness of night. And that form is like the Father. In the mysticism of Christianity, the Father, no one has seen the Father but except by the light that represents the power of the Father, is the Father known, is in the intensity of the truth of the light. And so what it represents then as the Sphinx, it represents the principle of ultimate creation materialized in such a way that there is a materialistic worship of form that represents something like a death wish. And so the riddle of the Sphinx is a death wish. That is, by our selfishness, we are punishing ourselves and we are killing ourselves. So, Oedipus, like all pilgrims or wanderers, is presented with a problem to solve. All initiations involve a problem or a work. Like, who is killing us? Or why do we suffer and die? It's the same question that was put before Buddha. It is the general question of initiation is, why do we suffer? Why do we die? Who's killing us? What is this death wish we have? But it comes in the form of what being with one voice has sometimes 2 feet, sometimes 3, and sometimes 4, and is weakest when it has the most. The simple answer is a human. But the question is extremely interesting in contradistinction to who puts the question, the bird of death. Death is an illusion that is born of materialism. This stuff looks like it's stopped. It looks like it's dead, and that it isn't alive. So what we're talking about when we're looking at the answer to the riddle and who puts the riddle is the Sphinx represents death or a death wish. But the riddle represents a process, a living process where things transmute and evolve from a 4-legged to a 2-legged to a 3-legged. So this is a sort of like an initiation question, like of the mysteries. It's like asking, what was I before I was born? What am I now? And what am I going to be after I am dead? And the answer is, I am a human. This is what I am. And it's very much like Shakespeare's, what is a man? Or David's statement, what is a man? So, this same question, this is the thing of the mysteries, when we realize that we in ourselves, in our small lives, are microcosms, analogous to the macrocosm, the same question can be understood in a deeper way. What was I before I was a human? And what comes after the human state? Not just before I was born or after I die. And the answer is there, before I was a human, I was a creature, like the 4-legged animals. And after I die, I will be a god. It's like saying, like we pass from the 4-fold animal-like state to the polar state where we're at now. Physiologically, we're like animals, but spiritually, we're like the gods. And we eventually will be 3-legged. That is, divine creative beings. So you can keep answering the same question deeper and deeper and deeper. So what is weakest? When it's weakest, it's a square. It's a form. When it is human, it is a discriminating pole of consciousness. And eventually it's a creative spiritual being. So in the most generic answer, it is always the human state. What we have been, what we are now, and where we are going. If we take the numbers and add them up, 4 and 2 and 3, it adds up to 9. And in all the mystery schools, 9 was always the number of humanity. For example, in the Pythagoreans, it still is in our culture yet. If you're getting angry, you're supposed to count to 10. And that is the process of going from unity to internal dialogue or division to spiritual triangulation to quaternary materialization, to five-pointed assimilation, to the six universalizing to the macrocosm, to the seven spiritually completing or perfecting, and then to the eight regenerating it into the nine, the human state right before becoming divine. And so that when one counts to 10, one is contemplating the whole process of evolution. And that in the process of going from in the beginning was the one, going all the way through to our human state, and what is naturally the follow-through of that into divinity is carried out in the process of counting from 1 to 10. In the Christian mysteries, 9 is also the number of humanity. That is a threefold body, physical, etheric, and desire, a threefold spirit, divine, life, and human spirit, threefold soul, conscious soul, intellectual soul, and human soul. Those three, all of those threes eventually get tied together and unified through the 10th, through the center of being in the mind. So in this view, a human is also represented by the number 9. And that's where 666 is somebody who has only body and soul but no spirit. That's along that same idea. In the modern mysteries, there are 9 initiations. 4 of them have to do with recouping everything we did from the past. Some of them have to do with what we are now, and the last 3 have to do with the last 3 revolutions of our current stage of evolution. And so the riddle of Oedipus is something that with regard to the number of 9, there are many, many, many interpretations, and they all devolve on us as humans, as singular beings, solving this mystery, becoming and knowing what we are, and seeing ourselves in a lively process rather than seeing ourselves in a stopped process, opting for life and not taking the hardening process of death. We have only one little detail of the story yet to look in, and that's something that's common to riddle myths. If you remember Rumpelstiltskin, after his name is given, and to know someone's name is to know the character of the being, he explodes. The fate of the Sphinx is similar. It dashes itself into pieces. This is what happens every day. Like in some lines of thought, such as, for example, I don't mean to be Catholic bashing at all, but it's the best example I can think of. If you think of mysteries as they are propounded by the traditional and historical Catholic Church, mysteries are to be revered. They are to be worshipped. But don't ever solve them, because then they would lose all of their awe. That is a way of looking at things that is extremely unpalatable to a child of fire. It's sort of like saying, don't bite into that apple. You'll break up its spherical integrity, and it won't look beautiful as a sphere anymore. And in a way, we are starving because we don't answer the problems of life. We choose death. We choose to eat and get older and harden and turn into stone rather than to choose life. In terms of initiation, if we answer the question, we explode it. Mysteries are meant to be dissolved. They're meant to be broken up and become food, like any other experience. Matter, is meant to be interacted with, bringing it to life. And when we do that, then we have a really full life. In fact, if we want things, we can even take the interpretation of the riddle of the Sphinx, the answer to it, we can turn that into another Sphinx. If we say that this truth is the truth and there is no other truth, and if we hang on to that, it'll become as deadly as anything else. If we remember in the story of Faust's deal with the devil is that the devil can have his soul whenever he says, let this moment live forever. And so then, the solving of the riddle of the Sphinx by Oedipus at the first stage of initiation that brings him to his kinghood, there are a number of stages that he goes through in the whole initiate process, is recognizing and taking life over death, and to look at things as a process and to see things and in a lively way, and not to wish death by selfishly saying, let me hold this thing to me, or let me hold this truth to myself. And the more that we can answer or solve that problem and see things in a living essence, the more we ourselves are Oedipuses in the making. And that's it for tonight. Next time we'll get at least the next page. I'll try not to go spin off into so many myths next time, because we want to get more and more into the ideas that are behind all of this. But I just thought I would give you an example of what it's like. Some people go on myth upon myth upon myth, and then they come back. And from time to time, though, we will call back other myths and reference them to what we're doing, because we can't get stuck in just one little thing or we lose the universal.